At the time, we really looked I looked up to a lot of people. So when their opinions came in, I just thought everybody was right. So they have a thing in these programs called mentor whiplash, which is like one person says this, and then you're like, oh, they say it so perfectly and seriously, like they're right. And then you talk to another person who has done so many things, sold their company for like $500 million, and they say a totally opposite thing. So you just keep going back and forth between this.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to My Social Life. This is the podcast where you can hear the real stories behind the people on social media. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. As always, today's podcast is powered by TRUFAN. Before we get into today's conversation with Mikael Cho, there's a couple things that we need to go over first. Number one, if you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to leave us a positive rating and review. The more positive ratings and reviews we get, the more it helps when people find the show, and it really helps to grow the community that we're developing here. And if you're one of those people that have previously found the podcast, welcome. I'm very excited to have you here. Make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for future episodes. I put out brand new interviews every single Monday, and a brand new takeaways episode where I sit down and break down the most recent podcast episode of the week is an audio exclusive every single Thursday. Last but not least, if you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to share it with a friend. Copy the link, send it to them. I would really appreciate that. And now, without further ado, I'm very excited to present to you my conversation with Mikael Cho. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to My Social Life. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. As always, today's podcast is powered by TRUFAN. And today on the podcast, we are joined by Unsplash CEO and co-founder Mikael Cho. What originally started as a side project to generate leads for a different business, now the biggest free image site on the planet, bigger than Shutterstock, Adobe Stock, and Getty Images combined. I'm very excited to have Mikael here on the show today to talk about how a Tumblr site built for under $30 has scaled to having more than 2 billion images available and over 1 billion images downloaded. Mikael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, man.
I'm excited to have you here. Where I want to start, I want to go all the way back to the beginning. You were born and raised in Wisconsin, correct? You went to the University of Wisconsin?
Yeah, that's correct.
And studied psychology, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes.
What was the intent behind going to school for psychology?
That was also an accident. I keep having these accidents. I went to university. It was an intro to business class, actually. So I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I just took a bunch of different things. And one of the courses that you need to take right away for business is intro to psychology. A lot of people found it really difficult. I found it really easy, but also fascinating. And I think that was the difference which made it easy for me. I just found it very interesting. And that was sort of a signal to just keep going further and further into that. I didn't necessarily plan for it to be something that I would use so much. I think there was interest there, and I thought maybe it would lead to something. But today, yeah, like that is the most, probably the most useful thing that I think about all the time is psychology.
Interesting. And so when you were at school, really, like you said, you weren't necessarily convinced that that was going to be the full path. So is that why throughout your career, you at college, you had a couple different experiences? I know you were a research analyst at the Wasteman Lab, but then the following year, you were the marketing and PR for the hospital clinics, right?
Yeah,
Was that
yeah.
just you trying to like figure out, like try different things to kind of figure out what stuck with you, or what was the kind of the intent behind that?
Yeah, my second year of university is when I started to get more serious about what I was going to eventually do to make money one day. And that summer, I remember just getting a sheet from like the career counseling service place of pretty much every job that you could possibly do with your different degrees that you had. And I just started looking at the lists, and there was some that I immediately could like cross off that I just didn't feel interested in at all. And then there was others. There's still like 100 left. Like okay, I got to narrow this down somehow. So I went to the alumni list that we had and looked at who worked in these positions, and I just wrote to each of them and said, "Can I job shadow you for a day?" I thought that would be the best way to figure out, is this something that I could see myself doing for a lifetime? One day, if you can't handle it one day, you're definitely not going to be able to handle longer than that. That was very useful for finding more things that I didn't like. I still didn't find something that I really loved. And those positions were more the things I actually did were things that I thought that I was actually going to be more interested in. So I knew I was generally interested in marketing, and that was a position that I was able to get access to. So it didn't really matter where I was practicing marketing. I just wanted to practice marketing. And then the same with psychology. I was just super interested in psychology, and that lab was the best one, in the city, in the state. And so being able to work there was just another way to practice the other thing that I was very interested in.
I think that's a great thing for students to hear. Just reaching out to these different people for 1 day job shadowing, especially as a student that carries so much leverage. I think that's just a great thing for students to hear. But ultimately, you end up graduating school, from my understanding, dead broke, but you're making your way to Montreal, correct?
Negative. I was worse than broke, man. Yes. This is 2008. So the economy was crashing at the same time. I didn't even really know that the economy was crashing. Like, I was so negative that I wasn't even at the point of getting into the opportunities that were being taken away. So, like, that's just sort of the relative where I was at. And then I met a girl who's now my wife, also a co-founder in Unsplash. She was from Montreal. I met her that summer that I graduated, and then I took a one-way bus to Montreal to visit her, and then didn't come back.
Mhm. And like from my understanding, being from Wisconsin, obviously, you don't speak French. So you were struggling to get a job early on, right? When you first got to Montreal?
Yeah, I didn't know how big a deal French was, so I thought, okay, a few people speak French, but it's like you need to be able to speak French to pretty much get any job that you could do here. So those are immediate challenges that happen here. And the only job that I could find here was a call center. And then after that, it's like I don't want to always be working at a call center, but what else can I do? And it's like I'm basically forced into starting a company.
But before that, 2000, that was 2008, the summer of '08, right? That was the same year the or the iPhone launched. And so correct me if I'm wrong, but did you download like a 30-hour course on how to launch an app in the App Store, something like
Yes.
that? Did you work on that summer?
Yeah. So that course was written by the guy who co-founded Flipboard, which was that magazine iPad app. Um, and he was like the go-to guy who was doing iOS development. Yeah, so I was just very interested in, I don't think it was engineering specifically, but I just creating something your own. That's what interested me, and I saw that potential existed there.
And so you mentioned how with not wanting to work in call centers, struggling to find a job. I know you worked at an agency, I believe it was called Blue. And then after you left there is when you got into Founder Fuel, right?
Yes, correct. So Blue was my first real taste of working with people who designed and engineered the internet. So it was a design agency, a small agency, and I was like a project manager, product manager. So I was just working with these people all the time, and I just loved it. Um, and that I think that was a big catalyst to what came next, which was okay. You're in an agency. You're always building things for other people. What if you could build something for yourself?
Because at the time, how cool is it when you figured out that someone would pay you to like work on your dream, like your business? Like, was that an unlock for you guys at the time when you first learned what an accelerator was?
Yeah, yeah. I didn't. I had no history of like Y Combinator or any of accelerator stuff that was going on. Just to give you an example of like what we knew when we got into, so Founder Fuel is an accelerator here in Montreal. When we got into that, they asked us to send a deck. They asked us to send a cap table. I didn't know what either of those were. I didn't even know what a deck was. So like that's where I was at. We didn't have the business registered. I didn't know how to do that. So yeah, we were. That's sort of the level. So when someone says, hey, we're going to give you this check, which is bigger than all of my consulting and contracting checks that I've ever gotten. We're going to give you this for you to build your idea. That just blew my mind.
It was 25K for 6%, right?
Yeah. Which like now I think they're giving like four times that, and at the time, 25K just seemed a lot. And I actually think that's a really special time. Like when you're feeling so humbled by that opportunity.
And the first idea, correct me if I'm wrong, but was that Uber Foundry?
So Uber Foundry was the name of the consulting firm that I started with an engineer, and that's what we entered into. We had different ideas. You could think of it like Basecamp and 37 Signals. That was the vision that we were sort of going after. We're going to, do consulting and freelance work, and eventually be able to build something of our own.
Mhm. And then so when you said how when you kind of applied to this accelerator, you didn't have any of the information. And from my understanding, like the idea within the accelerator changed multiple times throughout it, right?
Yep.
And one of the early ideas, which I'm very curious about, because this would have been super early on, but was it an influencer marketing platform that you started with?
Yeah, so the first idea was 2012. And at the time, Clout had just come out. I don't know if you remember that, but they would analyze your influence online. So Twitter influence was really just starting. Instagram was barely starting, and they were looking at who had the ability to shift perceptions and minds of people, and they just give you a simple number out of 100. Uh, and then I looked at that as your there's a much more elegant way that I can say it now. At the time, I didn't know the right words. I didn't know how to say this thing, but really, it's an exchange of social capital, which is what we see all the time now. So it kind of predated influencer and what was going on there. And what we were trying to do was automate it. So you would use someone's cloud score, and you would immediately, as a business, know, okay, if I want to do an exchange with this person, if they're going to share this thing, how much is that actually worth? So it's almost like, because based on the cloud score, you could tell roughly how much their tweet would be worth to you as a business.
Oh, so essentially like cross-reference whatever their close score was with their following and use that to generate a price for people to kind of figure out how
Yep.
much it would. Oh, that's
For a
super
brand to
interesting.
figure out, okay, are you cool? We could hire this person, and it's going to make sense.
Interesting. And so with kind of flip-flopping between ideas a lot, like that being one of the early ones, talk to me then about your first founder day.
Oh, so in these accelerator programs, it's designed to accelerate you, right? So the first day it's like dropping you in the deep end. You don't know anything. You pitch the first day, so you're pitching in the morning. That's the first pitch I ever did. Um, and yeah, so it's trial by fire, that entire thing. And I remember just looking at it like, I don't know. I always looked at it just like practice and learning, and I think that was a big advantage for us, because the amount of twists and turns that we went through, like it was almost every week in those first 3 4 weeks, we had to have different ideas, because I didn't have enough perspective to know what had been tried, what's working. I didn't have any mental models. I didn't really understand like all this stuff, so it was just a lot of naivety going into it. I think the benefit of that is we had so much enthusiasm. We just wanted to build something that would work and that we cared about. And so you're when you're in that state and there's this like pressure cooker around that, I think that it's easier to be more successful in a situation like that, because you just keep turning over and you're learning so quickly, than if you're tied to something that's not quite working, but because you're mentally tied to it, you can never give it up. So everybody else who came into the accelerator had ideas, and some were really far along. We came in with barely an idea, just basically like a landing page, and some people signed up for it.
Yeah. And so is there any advice from that first founder day that kind of sticks with you from those first couple pitches where from my understanding you guys got ripped apart in a couple of them? Like, is there anything that stands out to you still all these years, almost 10 years later?
At the time, we really looked I looked up to a lot of people. So when their opinions came in, I just thought everybody was right. So they have a thing in these programs called mentor whiplash, which is like one person says this, and then you're like, oh, they say it so perfectly and seriously, like they're right. And then you talk to another person who has done so many things, sold their company for like $500 million, and they say totally opposite thing. So you just keep going back and forth between this. And I think what's what I've learned is, when you design your own mental model and really understand what's sort of going on, you're better able to deal with those swings. Also understanding who's giving you advice, what experiences they went through. Just because somebody made X amount over here or they did something over here doesn't mean that they're going to be the perfect situation for what you're building.
Mhm. When you say like you have that mental model, is that like a mental model of like how you process the information, kind of categorize it, whether you take it in or not?
When it comes to ideas, it's more around what is your own insight. Instead of just thinking, okay, this is a cool idea. This should exist in the world and I think it should. So I'm going to make it. If you go deeper than that and you start to say, what's the unique insight? What is something that's changing in the world that is going to cause this thing to work? And then what might really cause that to explode in 2 4 years? Was something going to happen? Is the government is happening in telemedicine, right? Is the government going to change some regulation? Something that I know, is there some secret that's coming? Um, I hadn't done a lot of that thinking. Also, the human psychology that's related to it. Is this going to be a human condition? Is this related to something like that, where we can be flexible on the details of what this looks like, but we're strict on this human condition. And I didn't really have any of those strict boundaries. That's the mental model that would be built. It would still be fluid, but you have some core. Uh, Ours was more like we just want to build something great, and so like when that's the core, it can just move all over the place.
And so then after that founder day, I believe you and the co-founders whiteboarded, I think it was like 11 different ideas or something like that. And none of them were the idea, right?
Yeah, none of them. It was the night before you're going to go and present to all the mentors of the program. So this is everybody, all the major investors, all the advisors. And that night before, we changed the idea. We had some of this whiplash stuff we were thinking through, and we're like, it's just not going to work. It's not going to be good enough. So spent that night, yeah, whiteboarding different things, came, presented an idea. And yeah, because in one night, you can't think through it enough. You don't have the conviction. People can really feel that and sense that. And if you don't have it, a second someone challenges something, you answer it in a different way, and it kind of crumbles and starts to crumble, 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 and breaks down from there. So at the same time, an accelerator is a very challenging environment to come up with something because the program's like 3 months. So I think that's some of the cycling was because of that. But we were also learning a lot and just understanding ourselves of how to think through ideas strategically.
And then I believe it was after that then. So we were going through all these ideas, changed them at the last minute. But the one that ended up sticking eventually was Oomph, which went on to be named called Crew. That idea came to you in a noodle shop, right?
Yeah, yeah. So we were sitting, and a lot of the ideas we were thinking through they weren't solving problems that we had had. And so that was one of the mental shifts where we came up with Oomph, which was sort of like a Kickstarter, but for people who make apps. And the insight was a very big challenge. Like apps were just blowing up, and the App Store is full of it. But how do you stand out then? And a lot of people who make apps aren't necessarily marketing people. And so what we were doing was you're sort of pre-launching. You're able to tell the story. You're able to get people involved, build a community around your thing before it launches.
Do you remember the 9 steps to app discovery?
Yes. I don't remember all of them in order, but yeah, we launched. It was taking you through sort of the steps to get you set up to be able to market and distribute your app. So we just automated a lot of those things to walk you through almost like a checklist. But at the same time you're going through that checklist, there's people following along with you, and those people become your early adopters.
And at this point, was it, do you have all 4 co-founders at this point?
Yeah.
Yeah. And talk to me then about the impact kind of you mentioned there earlier how you moved to Montreal for then girlfriend, now wife, who's also your co-founder. From my understanding, the original Oomph office was in the basement. It was her parents' basement, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Talk to me about like that dynamic of living with your business partner, also dating your business partner. The business is in the home. Like, how do you
Yeah.
balance that dynamic?
Yeah, it's a pretty special mix to make that happen. So her parents, were Italian, strict, like usually no one's sleeping over, not even family, let alone this guy who came from Wisconsin, different country. And yeah, they were super gracious. I look at them as our first angel investors. They supported us in everything. Like they let me stay there. Her dad, said, "You don't pay rent. You guys just work on this thing and pay off your loans." So all of this stuff was huge to enable us to have the mind space to start these sorts of things. And yeah, to have this unique mix happen, I think it's just the right combination of personalities. Like it's really challenging to get parents and then your significant other and you. And if you're to get all those personalities in sync where you can live in the same place, spend almost all the 80-90% of the time together. Um, yeah, it's just a unique, very fortunate sort of combination of personalities. And I think that's just a kind of a luck thing.
Talk to me about then with that and just the idea of not being fancy. Cause I feel like in startup culture now, it's like once you're funding, you want to get the office, you want to kind of posture that you're a bigger company than you are. And you guys running this business out of a basement to start. And like even once you had an office, from my understanding, you used to bike to work instead of taking the metro because it was a little bit faster. You could save a little bit of money. It's like, talk to me about the idea of just not being overly fancy, just to kind of give off the impression that we're a fancy startup.
Yeah, because we had always done it that way. So as it's starting in the basement, you realize everything else is just overhead. So when you're just trying to be scrappy and survive all the time, that kind of becomes part of your nature. So you just do it all the time. So even when you have money, you're always in the space of that's just my habits that I built. Uh, and there was always ways to, hey, like when we bike, yeah, it was a little faster, but barely. But really it was like, hey, you can change your perspective on it. Like we can be outside and get a little exercise before we come in. It was really long. It was like a 35-minute bike ride. But yeah, there's those interesting things that just become part of your habits. And then you keep that as you go. So you have that extra piece always, even when you have a little extra money in the bank.
Talk to me about that though, about reframing your perspective with different things, like with the bike, you said you get to be outside and things like that. Has that been a skill or just something you try to do throughout this whole journey? Is whenever like things are going bad, try to flip the perspective and find the positive?
Yeah, always. And I don't know if I think the company may have done that, but I think I generally developed that mindset somewhere along the way. I do it with everything, even when we got a dog and you're building a company at the same time, and she wanted to go out all the time. I'm like, I don't know if I can do this. I got to focus on the work. But then when you have the mindset shift, it's like the dog allows me to break. I can use a technique for that. It allows me to get outside and think, which is very important, and focus on that and focus on what's going on. Sometimes I can just focus on her. And that's a moment of just being present and teaching you to be present. And then you can go back to your work. So, yeah, building that into everything. You've heard this, the mantra, like, 1,000 times. You can always choose to have the positive outlook. You can just change your brain. Um, and I've taken that to heart for everything.
You said how being with the dog too makes you present, and does that, it makes me think, when in those moments initially where you're like, I don't think I can do this because the dog's asking you to go out, is that because you're not being present in the moment because you're thinking of all the things that are coming down the road, and taking 30 seconds to let the dog outside, it just seems like the biggest task right now? Is that, does being present in the moment help you realize just kind of the granularity of this issue that's not actually as big a deal as you're making it?
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the challenges too is you read all these things about trying to get into flow, and the switching costs of getting out of flow. Uh, and so that's where it comes from. But there is a cost to being too much into that, right? Like then if a little minute thing happens in life and you just can't deal with it because it took you out of flow, your emotional state is just going to be going like this all the time. Doorbell's going to ring, a package that you didn't know was there, and you're going to freak out. And that's not a way that I want to operate. So yeah, I learned this stuff is going to happen. Be used to it. Um, and then you can find systems to try to prevent some of it. So before I go into a flow state, for example, I'll often message people, my wife when I'm working at home, and be like, "Hey, I'm just going to go in a flow state now for like an hour and a half. So I'm going to be less responsive."
Yeah, it's like turning, it's like when, because it's such a small thing. It's, but what, like you said, it kind of, it makes your emotions go up and down. It's like turning a crumb into a crater on your path. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like you're just making it a much bigger deal. But back to that, to the oomph idea. From my understanding, I believe it was you had the idea in the noodle shop. 9 weeks later, you raised 500K, right?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So on that idea, I think so. The investor who led it was the one who ran the accelerator program. What they saw was not just the idea. I think they just saw our rate of learning, our rate of iteration, how we dealt through those challenges, and that's what impressed them. And I think it was more like, yeah, they could figure something out on this idea, but if they don't, they're going to figure something out eventually.
And part of that too, correct me if I'm wrong, but like the day or two before the raise, you had like 150 people on the site or something like that, and you like hacked it to get it up to 2,000 people, right?
Yeah, so we were always looking for ways to try and grow. We had app developers who were signing up, and then we're like, how could we really turn this into an exponential? What could that potentially be? And I don't remember. how exactly we did it, but we were able to find a bunch of like app developer emails. Not in even like a weird spammy way. I think it was like available on the App Store or some network that had developers and was making it accessible to find their emails. And then we didn't message them in a weird spammy way either. We just said very personalized, "Hey, we're making this thing. We made a page for your app, so we knew the app and the developer. Here's what it would look like. If you want it, you can claim it and then go and do a whole bunch of stuff with it. Otherwise, we'll just take it down." And that was yeah, that just blew up. And that was a couple days before we had the demo day.
Yeah, that's crazy because you almost more than what it I don't even I can't even do the math off the top of my head. More almost 20x your
Yeah.
users in that small window of time. And we talked about earlier how you got the 25K check and that was just more money than you've ever seen. Talk to me about now when you look at your bank account, you get the check and you see six zeros or five zeros, sorry, $500,000. What's going through your mind at that point in time? You have your first like big raise.
So yeah, really, we're still young. That's like more money than we've ever seen ever. Um, it feels like we can do so much, and then you start to do some of that. And again, now you're learning how to do some of the real stuff in starting a company. You know, where to allocate the money, how to do that, how to hire people. So yeah, tons of learning and mistakes that happened on that one. And we'll probably talk about this more later, but when we switched eventually to Unsplash, I remember the difference. You know, so we raised that 500K. That was the first round for Oomph and crew, compared to the actions that we took after we had raised the money for Unsplash. Like when we had raised the money after for Unsplash, it was just like going back to work the next day. You know, we knew exactly what we needed to do. Whereas when we raised that 500K, it was like, what's the order that we need? That I think is the biggest thing when you do this enough, when you start to understand. It's you can do so many things, but what the most important thing is the order that you do them in.
You kind of explain, like, can you give like some form of an example of what would that mean? Like, just as like not specifics, of course, or like getting into the company details or anything, but like what that would look like kind of in general or in practice for other companies.
Yeah. We need to hire this person. We need to do this on social media. We need to go on these podcasts. We need to get PR. We need to get an office. Uh, do we get an executive assistant? So those are all those questions. And then it's like, I think a lot of companies try to do too much of it at once uh, versus how do you prioritize that? And a lot of companies also get that wrong. That's the challenging part. It's like which ones of these are most important. And we've just gotten better and better and better at that over time.
And so, what are some of your kind of criteria for how you prioritize that and how you rank these questions that you need answers to?
My thinking on this has refined down to the CEO's only job is to compound leverage. So if you think of those ideas, you should not be basically doing anything that will not compound leverage. So getting an office, the question is, does it compound leverage? And if you don't know what can create leverage for your company, then take one step back from there. And a lot of what we did when we started Unsplash was, what is the flywheel that's going to create leverage? What are the pieces? And the way we think about that is the library, discovery, distribution. And if any one of those goes up, everything is a self-fulfilling thing. It just keeps going up. So basically anything that doesn't fit inside of that, we shouldn't do. And that's been a big shift for us in how we think about things and what to prioritize.
And one of those things you did early on was you did a lot of blogging and guest blogging, right? I believe it was Paul Jarvis who convinced you to start guest blogging, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm wondering, Paul, yeah, I was really close with Paul in the beginning because Medium had just started opening up to writers, and that's when I found Paul, and his stuff is amazing. Uh, I don't know if I read something by him, but yeah, one of the big things that we started doing in the beginning was guest blogging, and this was big at the time. It was just starting. Buffer was sort of the leader there, and they wrote a tactic of how they did their guest blogging, and I used their tactic to talk to them. So I sent them a message and said, "Hey, you should really write something on this topic, but if you don't have time, I'll write it." And that was kind of the thesis of their email that they would send. And so they said yes, and That was my first guest blog. I probably would have kept going with that if I didn't see the impact of Medium. So when Medium came, and we figured out like how to write well and how to have things perform well there, it just was outperforming all the guest blogging stuff. So we just focused there.
Was it your first guest blog on Medium that got picked up by TED? Or sorry, your first guest blog on Buffer that got picked up by
Yeah,
TED?
yeah,
So that's you then with 1.1 million views or whatever it is right now on YouTube with the TED Ed video?
yeah. This the how to overcome stage fright.
Yeah. How did that feed back into what you were doing with Oomph? And did you see a lot of traction from that video and that blog?
The thesis of what topics to write about, I also studied that, and that came from the buffer thesis, which was your customer is here that you're trying to reach, but in order to reach a big number of them, you actually want to reach the people who will reach them. So by writing about a broader topic, you can reach those people that you want to reach eventually. And so stage fright, yeah, I just started writing about stuff that was interesting to me. That was the criteria. I've since like edited my thesis a bit on this, and I think Buffer has too. But yes, so that was choosing a large topic based on that thesis, uh, and it brought it was the number one thing that was bringing people in. It was because number one also because it was one of the only things we were doing. Um, and yeah, it was like just an easy thing for us to consistently do. And I just said every week I'll do this, and it'll be our like kickstarting our growth. And ideally, the product starts to catch up and is good enough to retain these people, and then they start referring people, and word of mouth starts to kick in. But the writing will be the thing that like kickstarts it at the beginning.
How has your kind of approach to it changed today?
So I would think more thoughtfully about it if content was something that was important to us. Um, I would probably write more directly in most cases. There is something about a potential balance approach, but the thought that's going like writing bigger, that will reach a lot of people, but then also more direct articles. Um, but the thing that's running through my head is focus matters too. So every article that you write that's for this bigger audience is an article that potentially you can't write. That's writing direct to people. So I still don't know the exact approach, but what I know now is that I don't know. And back then I thought that was the holy grail. You follow this system, and that's going to be the way that works. And I think they got it from somebody who was also really smart. I don't remember exactly who it was, but somebody who was thinking a lot on it.
I've spoken to a lot of entrepreneurs, and it's one thing sometimes they're not comfortable saying is, I don't know. So, how do you find it within yourself to be comfortable to admitting you don't have the answers to everything? Because I feel like sometimes entrepreneurs, because they're the last stop, there's no one else to put the blame onto. There's no one else. They feel like they need to know everything. So, where do you get that comfort level to just admit, I don't know when it comes to certain things?
Yeah, I don't. I think it's just an honesty thing when you're trying to learn things, right? If you're in a learning mindset, um, you're comfortable being in the I don't know space for a long time, and so I think when you're in that space a lot, you're okay saying it also.
Mhm. One of the other tactics you did early on, especially trying to get some PR, is you had a dashboard on Hootsuite, right? With a bunch of different media members that you would engage with to try and get in front of them. You're still doing that today personally with your own Twitter, right?
Yeah, and I do a lot of it is I think the reason why it's sustained is because 'cause I'm just genuinely interested in it. Like, I like people who write and create and can think thoughtfully, um, and I just like connecting and talking with those people. Every year, I do sort of like a 80-20 analysis on, what were the 20% of things that made me 80%, like, fulfilled and happy that year, and usually it comes down to just people, who were the people I was with and that I was hanging out, and yeah, that just excites me and energizes me. So I think that's also why I've been able to keep doing it. But yeah, that was one thing.
And so how much time are you spending on that now every week?
It fluctuates with the company goals and how it aligns with creating leverage. So if you would look at my Twitter behavior from 2017 to 2019, it would be like 1/10 of what I'm doing right now. And that's because I was focusing on something else where that just didn't create leverage for us at the time. So this is a sequencing thing as well. Like I couldn't put my time there and do this really well. So I solved this problem to the point where now someone else is taking it over. And at the same time, what we're doing from a PR perspective, Twitter matters a lot more now. So I spend more time there. And that's just all again coming back to how do you create the most leverage and what do you choose to do?
Mhm. So I want to talk about Unsplash. Before we talk about Unsplash, talk to me about the power of constraints because I feel like that's going to be a theme throughout the next part of this conversation. How has constraints kind of bred creativity or innovation for you throughout your career?
Constraints are the best. I find anytime it's open, even if you think it's better. I've always just seen when you have some sort of constraint around it, whether it's a money constraint, whether it's a time constraint, a space constraint, that all um, clarifies things very, very quickly. So I will always set random deadlines on myself for stuff because it will immediately cut things. It forces me not to do certain things and pay attention to certain things. Um, I've written a bit about how I write. Usually I'll write on my phone and I intentionally have the smaller screen phone. And that's so that I don't overthink what we're creating. And there's also a constraint that is put there. It's one of the reasons why I really like Twitter is also because of the constraints.
That's interesting because I talked to, I don't know if you know Tyler Babin or not. Worked for Gary Vee for a little while. And his big thing is like when it comes to creativity, if you have no constraints, that's almost an overwhelming thought because there's so many, you can go in any direction. It's like when you first raise that money where there's so many things you can do and you can in theory pursue all of them. So those constraints allow you to kind of narrow the focus. And so talk to me about the constraints that were applied that led to you guys creating Unsplash. From my understanding, you had a couple months left of that first 500K and you need to grow abnormally fast in a little amount of time. So why was Unsplash that idea?
And no code. So I was responsible largely with marketing and growing at the time, and I don't code, so that was a really good constraint because it didn't allow me to overthink and I had to think to the basics like what could we make that would have a huge impact that didn't require any code. So that immediately like just knocks out so many things, and you're always thinking in that direction. Uh, yeah, so you're right. Those are the other constraints that we had at the time. Uh, and we were thinking about what are the little problems that we could solve for somebody before they would need crew. Crew had evolved at that point into connecting people who were building websites or apps with engineers and designers, high quality and vetting everything. And before you hire people, you're usually asking a whole bunch of questions like how much is it going to cost? And then maybe you're designing stuff, you're making mood boards, you're thinking of how it's going to look. And that's where the photography came in. And we thought, hey, this is something that we could create that would not be a lot of work for us. Uh, I'll go in like every 10 days. So there's still a repeatability. Like there's going to be a reason for people to come back. We'll do 10 images every 10 days and you can use them for whatever you want. And it would be the thing that we wished existed when we're creating stuff. And yeah, in an afternoon, we just put up the thing that we wished existed, and using no, code or anything, just trying to make the thing look how we would ideally like to see this. So just like these big images, 10 in a row, and then you could just hit a download button and you had the high res version.
Before we're going to dive further into that, why was creating an additional product the move for you when you need to grow really fast? And a lot of people think we need to grow fast. They're thinking of growth hacking or different marketing things, but your decision was to just build a whole separate product and let that funnel to crew. Why was that the move?
When we were building Crew, there was a lot that we needed to build inside of it in order to get it to be really sticky. So you could think of this as a comparable because it's something that a lot of us have used, Uber. Uber has so many things built inside of it, and it needs to be built at a certain level probably before you're going to share it, with a lot of people. Um, so we wanted to take something that we knew this is going to take months. We don't have months to build this to the point where that starts creating word of mouth. So let's build something that sits just in front of that we know people will come back to, and it solves the problem right before they're going to do this thing. Uh, and in hindsight, that was I think the right strategy then, but it was the right strategy born from a whole bunch of probably wrong strategic decisions. At the time, it was the right thing to do. Um, but yeah, like in hindsight, the focus eventually, because we kept coming up with these different ideas that created this thing. Um, I've learned a lot from that where we're just thinking being a lot more thoughtful about anything that we would ever do outside of Unsplash, and we never do anything outside of Unsplash. Just to give you sort of the polar opposite example.
Mhm. And so, like I said in the intro, it costs you less than $30. I think it was like $9 for the domain, $19 for the Tumblr theme. You posted on Hacker News, and day one, 20,000 downloads. So clearly, this did your 20,000 hits right away. It became the number one traffic source for Crew. I believe you got 3x the paid customers that first day than you had gotten prior. At that moment, were you like, we're onto something with this Unsplash thing? Or was it just like, this is the greatest traffic source we could have ever gotten? Like, were you thinking of them as potentially being two separate businesses like day one, or did that come later on?
That was later. Yeah,
Mhm.
at the beginning, it was this is an amazing traffic source. It's doing 10 times, 100 times better than we ever thought. Set it and forget it. Let it keep rolling, and now we can focus on the product. We have basically a steady stream of customers coming in.
And with the constraint of the 10 photos every 10 days, so obviously that kept bringing people back. But I was curious if you think the 10 photos every 10 days led to you getting a higher quality photo and like input from the community. Because if your photo was to be selected, it was one of the 10 best photos in that time frame. So it's just more people trying to post, almost have like the not the clout, but for lack of a better word, the clout of being one of those 10 photos because it was one of the 10 best. Like, do you think that led to higher quality of content being submitted to you guys?
I do, yeah. There was an aspiration that ended up happening where you aspired to get your image into the 10. It wasn't really necessarily the original intention. It was just like we didn't think we could keep up with reviewing more than that, and we didn't know if people would submit that many. So we are like, oh, we could do 10 if we needed to. Um, but yeah, there was a beautiful side effect of that where the quality every 10 days was getting better and better and better and better. Because yeah, I think you aspire to submit into this.
And why call it Unsplash and not something related to Crew? Like, why not like Crew photos or something like to that extent? Like, why brand it completely separately?
The thought there was we wanted to win like a bigger thing, and people will remember something that is usually sitting on its own domain, better than like crew.co/free dash photos. People won't remember that, but they'll remember Unsplash. And so we felt that the trade-off, you're going to be able to the word of mouth will catch more doing this, which means, the conversion, you'll probably net positive versus if this was sitting in a subdomain on Crew.
Mhm. And so then how are they being funneled back to Crew? Was it like Unsplash powered by Crew or something like that? Like, how are they getting from one site to the other?
Yeah, it was just a single link that said made by Crew. I think there was only 15 words total on the page, so it really like is Unsplash, the tagline made by Crew. And so yeah, it was sitting in prime placement.
Mhm. I've heard you say that to get somebody to switch from like a competitor of yours to your business, you need multiple wow moments. So I kind of want to flip that question a little bit. And what were the multiple wow moments for you that led to you realizing that maybe Unsplash was the option over Crew? Was it growing like 32x on Unsplash from year one to year two? Or like, what were those multiple wow moments for you and the team that made you go stop and go, maybe we should change up and focus on Unsplash instead?
Yeah, the first day was one moment, but you can have those blips happen for a lot of different things. The next one was when I went in 10 days later, and it's tripled, and 10 days later, and it's tripled again. Yeah, and we're not doing anything. We're doing the opposite of what everybody says you should do to build a successful company, and the thing is still growing. And growing faster than Crew. So that was we only needed, I think, one wow moment there was seeing that repeated just market pull. People wanted this thing to exist. People were building stuff off of it from day one. Like somebody made a Dropbox thing that would save the images and you could just download the Dropbox folder. Stuff like that. You don't see that normally unless people really want what you're building.
And so ultimately, the first, because you launched Unsplash 2013, I believe, first full time employee was that 2014 or was it later than that?
First, I don't remember the first full time for Unsplash.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we only had one person go on Unsplash in that period. That was my co-founder, Luke. So he went full time on Unsplash that fall. Yeah.
And I know you ended up launching kind of a series of side products after that. I believe I have a couple of them written down here. One was like how much is like to build an app and different things like that. What made Unsplash different from the rest of them? Like why was the first one so special? Was it beginner's luck? Were you trying to like manufacture that same success that Unsplash had with these other ones? Like why was Unsplash so much more successful than the rest?
I think the market size was just really big. Even though at the beginning the tagline was very specific. It was like these are our high res images for your website. So we were like very narrow on the use case because we wanted to attract the right people, so it would eventually refer to crew. How much to make an app.com in its own right was very successful in terms of like highly targeted people who really definitely would want to use crew one day, but it didn't have the same size, right? Unsplash, that's one of the reasons why we actually decided to spin Unsplash out, because at one point, like 80% of the audience or the downloaders were not even using it to put images in their apps and websites. It was just all kinds of other creative stuff.
Okay. And I want to ask this kind of maybe a bit of a random question, but talking about the Unsplash book, what led to you guys deciding to do that? And just out of curiosity, I logged on and I clicked on the link. I don't know if Amazon was glitching. The price has since changed, but I jumped in there and it was priced at $46,000. Um, so excuse me, tell me like if you know why it was so expensive and what kind of the idea behind the Unsplash book was.
I have no idea why it's so expensive. Maybe there's some like black market that's happening on
It's
Amazon
it's
right now.
gone down to 900 since then, but I like clicked and I was like $46,000. Man, that's crazy.
It's
But I was just
limited print, so maybe like someone's trying to sell it as like a collector's item at this point. Um, yeah, we looked at it as first. Your Kickstarter was another platform at the time that was starting up, and we saw it as an opportunity. A lot of people who are on Kickstarter are probably good potential customers of Crew. We can celebrate our community at the same time. So the goal is really to like get it featured on Kickstarter, so that ideally we can have another spot on another growing platform that has the right kind of customers who might be interested in Unsplash. But the main reason we did it was we had all these people who were contributing images, and we didn't have profiles or anything. So there was no like feedback loop on how amazed we were with what they were submitting. So the book was a celebration of that.
Mhm. Okay. And so Unsplash is having this meteoric success, but at the same time, you're like, there's still the two companies. You're still working on Crew. And I have a quote here. I think it was from 2015. And it was you saying you'd heard from investors. I thought you guys were going to die 6 months ago. I thought Crew was dead a year ago, but you always kept figuring it out. What kept you guys going through all those where all the investors are even doubting you at this point? Like, what keeps you pushing through all those difficult moments, through those dips?
Uh, One of the things for us is we've always just wanted to create a great business, one that's impactful. The rest is details. So we just kept pushing until we feel that that has happened. It's like we don't know any other way. There's just not a way of giving up. Um, Myself and my wife, we used to play sports at a high level, so we have that kind of bred into us. You never give up, and I think we've taken that into the company as well.
Mhm. And then I believe it was shortly after kind of you're getting those comments from investors, you raise your $10 million round. How does that differ from a $500,000 round?
I think it's the stage of where you're at and the expectation that starts to come a little bit with it. Even with yourself, you start to have a perceived value of what the company is worth, even though only one or two people or three, depending on how many investors you have put that value on you. Uh, so that's there a bit. I think we were relatively good at not letting that affect us too much as we were building. So I don't think it made too big of a difference on us, apart from just really knowing now, when you get $10 million, the next day we're just right back to working where we were. Where when we got the 500K, we were just inexperienced in getting money. So it's like we didn't know exactly what to do the next day after.
I've heard you say that Crew almost you tried to grow too quickly and overbuilding is a big problem. Was part of but did that come when you raised that $10 million? You have 10 millions now. There's almost like a pressure to execute with this money you've just raised. And is that when you would lend to building too quickly?
The biggest thing was excitement. You're excited and you see the potential, and that was the big thing that we learned from Crew and that we brought to Unsplash was the sequencing. And I think the mental model that we've built is when in doubt, you build in sequence instead of in parallel. Whereas with Crew, we'd be like, these are two great ideas. Build them both. We'll hire and we'll make it happen. Uh, and I think we also have a higher bar for evaluating an idea. So in Crew, these are two great ideas. They would be much more scrutinized in the Unsplash world today, and then we'd probably only do one if any. So it's you can see the total difference of the thoughtfulness around each idea.
Mhm. I'm curious how you balance, despite growing really quickly with Crew and putting a lot of emphasis on growing quickly, but at the same time hiring slowly. Because from my understanding, you and the team at Crew, the four co-founders, you still just after the $10 million raise, were still part of the interviewing process for every single employee, right?
Yeah,
Why was there an emphasis on that despite kind of like the urgency to grow quickly?
yeah. I mean, that's been said in many places. The team you build is the company you build, and that's why we focus so much on it. It doesn't really like as a founder, you can say as much as you want that this is what you want to build and this is the mission and these sorts of things, but the people who build it are the people inside of the company. So you need just total alignment, and you're going to battle with all of these people. So that really matters a lot. It's like the single biggest source of ongoing leverage that you have in your company. So you should be spending a ton of your time there.
I mean, I know everyone's approach is a little bit different, but what's your approach to hiring? What are you looking for when you're going to welcome people into the family of the company that you're building?
So I look a lot for an insane rate of learning. So we've got positions that are open, and then we'll get people coming through, and I'm looking for some evidence that you have this very high growth rate in learning paired with great taste. So, is what you create or what you share, or even how you send your materials, certain people will send it using certain things. Some people will send back in an email, very nice, not trying to go too fluffy. Some people will send like very complicated document that has different font sizes, trying to make it too pretty. Like it depends what you're sending it for, but I look at all of those signals as an evaluation of the good taste piece, and then you can sort of identify rate of learning, and then yeah, you can meet them and speak and see what they've done to understand the current skill set. But if they've got the current skills and then they have an insane rate of learning and great taste, they're going to be a really great fit. And then the last piece is vibe. So it's like just how are you vibing together? Because yeah, you're going to be working together all the time.
Mhm. So, how many signals do you think you're kind of evaluating on for each individual person? If you were to ballpark that number,
I think there's an initial 5 or 10 that you're getting, and the more you do it, you're getting them really quickly. Uh, so I think you're looking at someone come in. I'm looking at their email. I'm looking at how do they format it, what words are they using, how short, how long, and if it's long, why is it long? And that's happening within like a second or two. Then you're clicking through their stuff, and you're getting these quick views of what they care about, how they think, and then you're sort of building that filter, and you're building do they fit some of those initial principles where you should go deeper.
are there any things that consistently stand like a signal that whenever you see, that's a really good sign, like a consistent thing that with the amongst the team that you have right now?
In terms of when you find them first.
Yeah, like when you're first going through that email, it's just like a consistent thing you see and you go, okay, like that's like something you always look for. Like, of course, there's the taste and there's all that, but like, is there any like just little things that always catch your eye?
Yeah, how they write that first email, and that's one of the reasons why we don't really like we have a thing where you can submit to an email, but I'd prefer someone just writes to me. I prefer someone finds my email, finds my co-founder's email, and writes them a very thoughtful, personal email. And it's almost like a test to see, will you do that? Will you take the time to do that? And even if you do that, is it good? You know, did you think about it in the right way? Do you understand how to communicate to somebody um, that can get them to come back to you? And that's ultimately going to be huge, probably in any position that you're doing inside of a company.
Did the hiring change at all for your coffee shop for Crew Collective, or was it a similar approach when you're hiring for the coffee shop?
Similar approach. I didn't in the beginning. We hired the manager, the person who was going to lead the whole thing, and then taught him the same principles, and then he went and executed on them. So I can't speak to exactly how well we did that, but the collective workspace did do very well.
Mhm. For anybody listening, they're probably a little bit confused at this point. So can you kind of talk to me about the idea of, so again, with these side projects leading back to the main idea, what led to you guys opening a coffee shop for Crew? Like, what was the thought process behind that?
So this was still in the mind frame of we are going to create something, and this was another model that we always had in our head. If we're going to create something anyway, is there a way that there's a byproduct of it that we can sell? So we're going to do this thing anyway. Is there some piece of it that can become marketing for the business as well? And that's where the idea for the office space. So we had started to look for an office space. This would be our first one. Company was expanding. Um, and then we were also not very used to having rent be a cost item for us because we never had an office. So we're like, maybe there's a way that we can equalize that, but also have a very big marketing thing that can be great for attracting talent, can be great for hiring, recruiting. So we decided to open an office, and then part of it was going to be an open workspace for freelancers, anybody to come work from, and we thought that would be great. Sort of the physical representation of Crew. We're just taking what's online and making it offline.
And it was this Crew Collective, like, not COVID considered, but is it still open today?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yes. It's
awesome.
you in most things, ranking things, you'll see it's the number one cafe or workspace in Montreal.
Mhm. So did you retain like ownership of that in the split of the two companies, or did that go
No,
with
so
Crew?
Unsplash was all, like, focused. So it's like
Yeah.
we just split everything, sold and got everything set up properly, and then so the Unsplash would be the only thing we're focusing on.
And so when you made that decision to split, was that tough for you that the main idea wasn't working as well as the side idea, that you were devoting no time? Like, was, as an entrepreneur and someone who's running this company, is it hard for you to admit to yourself that this thing we have one person working on is outperforming this thing we have a full team of people working towards?
You feel that it's gonna work at some point. I think that's what everybody feels, right? So even if something's not working, you're doing enough things that you feel eventually you're gonna figure it out. So I think it was really more about one of my co-founders said, we should put a stick in the ground. We're having a meeting in this quarter. We are saying this is going to happen on Crew, and we've said this every quarter, and I believe you. And but what happens if it doesn't happen? I think that should be something that we should reflect on. So I think that's been a very useful exercise that we've used in so many things. We put a stake in the ground. We said, okay, this in this meeting, we said this is going to happen in 90 days. So I put a notification in the calendar. We put what we said, and then 90 days happened. Those numbers didn't hit. And when you looked backwards, you're like, oh, we're not really hitting these every single time. So you might get there, but there's this huge, just like cost to time. Plus, you've got this now new opportunity cost, that Unsplash that's sitting there that's also underserved. And having two together, you're underserving both. But that was the situation that happened. It wasn't necessarily about uh, yeah, I feel bad that we're spending all this time here and not this much time here, and it's hard for me to let go of this idea. I think there was just something that my co-founder created, that moment to reflect, which was very important.
Mhm. And so talking about the process of splitting and selling the companies, you ended up selling it to Andrew Wilkinson, right? Because he had just acquired Dribble and then they acquired Crew.
Yeah.
What was that
Yes,
process like?
I wrote to Andrew just for advice because he had been buying companies and investing in companies, and this was just at the start of Tiny Capital. I didn't even know that he bought Dribble, and I said, "Hey, we're thinking about doing this. We're thinking about potentially splitting these off, selling them, maybe partnering with something." And he said, "Well." maybe we should talk because I just bought Dribble. And he's like, well, make it painless. It'll be fast. And he knew the situation that we were trying to do it fast because we just didn't have a lot of capital and we were continuing a lot of that capital is going towards Unsplash to continue on with it. Uh, so yeah, he just said, this is roughly what it would be. This is what I would offer. And we close in like 2 months. Uh, and so we went, and we still ran a process and talked to some folks, but the amount extra that they were willing to pay was still like weren't sure if that was gonna really be that amount at the end and the amount of time. That was the key. Like we're like, this is just gonna take all of my time, and we need to be setting these up properly for the next year.
Mhm. Was it kind of a full circle moment to have Dribble acquire Crew? Because if I'm not mistaken, you used to like promote and try and get people that use Dribble to come over and check out Crew. So it's kind of a nice full circle moment to have them be the one that acquired the company.
Yeah, we were partnering with Dribble. I love Dribble. Um, so to have that possibility happen, it's also one of the reasons why we chose it. We are like, this is exciting, and the crew team that was there was excited also by it. And yeah, I was very excited because what Dribble was for me was probably the first source of internet inspiration for me when I came on.
Mhm. And then so you didn't really get a chance to kind of celebrate the acquisition. Like normally an acquisition for an entrepreneur is like such a big deal, but you basically sold the company and you were like heads down right into Unsplash. I'm pretty sure you jumped right into a raise, right? Like your 7.25 million round.
Yeah.
That did you have the path to profitability for Unsplash kind of established at that point? Like, did you know what the model was going to be, or was that part of what you were figuring out prior to pitching all these different investors?
Yeah. So I had basically 6 months to prepare. So we didn't have a clear like thesis on things. We knew roughly different ideas, but it hadn't been crystallized yet. So I just spent a lot of time thinking through that, how it would work while doing all the other things of running the company. But that was a really important moment to spend that time and also a challenging moment. Yeah, to basically just sold in the next day, start right away again, and almost in a way feeling like you're starting over.
I read somewhere that one of the first, I don't think you considered social media very briefly, but you kind of X'd that idea out right away. And I'm curious why one of the early decisions was not to turn Unsplash into social media. Cause at year 5, you were doing more users per engineer than Facebook was at their year 5. So how come social media was not the route for Unsplash?
We looked at what we tried some things. So there was different features that we tried. Feed being one of them. The behavior that people were doing, they weren't coming for entertainment basis. We also didn't have an edge, and there's lots of people doing entertainment visual networks. And then information, there was ideas around adding information around these photos. So it'd be like a Wikipedia and you could have all this stuff. But someone is really good at information. So there's already like sites, a giant search engine that does that. So we looked at the unique thing that we do is use. Like we allow you to find images that you can use. So it's much more of a search destination. And then the strategy compounded from there when we also have the API. So that is an interesting way for us to get scale is we can build into other creative platforms and tools and just be where all those people are creating.
And so for those that don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong if I'm explaining this too simply, but the API essentially lets other sites use the Unsplash API to put it on their site so they can use the search functionality of Unsplash within their website, right?
That's right. Yeah. So it's built into like medium.com. If you want and needed an image for a blog post and you search it, it just pulls everything from Unsplash right in the inside of Medium. Same thing with Google Slides, Squarespace.
How are you getting all of these people to use the API? Is it relationships you have offline that lead to that, or what led to them using Unsplash's API?
It was a cold start at the beginning, so we didn't know anybody. It started grassroots too, so we just made an open API that people could build with. And then some of those engineers and designers went and started working for these companies and said, "Hey, it was really useful on my side project. We could use this here at the company too." And then there was a very intentional moment when my co-founder and wife, Steph, she just took it on. We realized how important it was of a strategy, and so she went. We made a list of just the top companies. We looked at all the interfaces and said, "This would be really great for both the company and Unsplash," and just went after them.
But you don't charge them to use the API, right? Like it's free and open, you said?
Yeah,
And then so your entire monetization model is based off of advertising, right?
that's right.
And I've heard you explain Unsplash as like digital real estate. Can you kind of explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, when I think about the internet, it's all real estate, right? It's like it's all, especially when it comes to advertising. Like advertisers are always trying to put their ads in the best real estate so that you see them and pay attention. That's why like Times Square is the way it is. It's why the internet is the way it is. You know, it's like getting disrupted and all these things. But the way most of advertising is built is exactly that. I look at it as it's like the shittiest part of real estate, right? It's like the stuff on the outskirts. It's the stuff that you don't look at. We don't look at anymore. We've been conditioned to not pay attention to those kinds of advertisements. Uh, but Unsplash, you're you're actually becoming part of the prime real estate. So if you're a brand and you come and like we work with Square, for example, and their cash register product, and let's say you're writing a blog post on the future of the cash register on Medium, and you search an image that you need, and then the top ones that show up are Square, and they're really nice, and you want to use them. It's a benefit to you because it's improving your article. You've got a great image that goes with it. Square gets a great benefit. They've built that association. They're sitting now in the prime real estate. That image with the headline is most of what people will remember from that article, that chunk, and then a couple more bits that happen. So that's what we mean by real estate. Like we're putting inside of those different real estates, and the real estate and the internet is becoming more visual. So I would say the internet was probably more text based real estate, and now it's becoming more visual based real estate.
How do you track attribution for the images? Like I use Unsplash pretty much every day. But I was one ad that came up was for MailChimp. Like if I download that image and I use it on my blog, how can you kind of attribute all the extra impressions that MailChimp would be getting from that image?
So we don't know exactly when you come and download and put it on your blog post. If you have an API integration, we can roughly say how many views or downloads are coming from that integration and share that with them. So the majority of the attribution just comes from like views and downloads that are happening on splash.com and through the API. But we're still able to go and find a lot of these public uses. So when you publish that post, and we have reverse image search stuff that can go and say, hey, here's the things that were created. And then we run data studies along with these to just say, how did this change people's minds? And we run double blind studies with people who are participating in these to uh, to see what actually changed.
Okay. And I've heard you say, correct any of these numbers if I'm wrong, but typically campaigns are 150 to $2 million and you recommend they run 6 months. How come the half year timeline is what the recommendation is?
Most of it is the brands running these kind of cycles. So it's eventually, I think when brands start to prove out and get used to Unsplash more, it's going to be more of like an always on thing because the longer you keep it, it's actually an exponential factor. You're getting all this benefit of people using your images, uh, and that's just huge for a brand ending up in different places that they could never end up if they were just advertising, and it just compounds the longer you leave it up. But 6 months just happens to be that time frame where brands are typically buying in those kind of allotments.
Okay. And I'm curious around kind of like consumer privacy and things like that, because as we're seeing with like Facebook and app right now, and Google's talking about eliminating their third party cookies. So does your model then essentially, because it's just based off search queries, you're not tracking anybody or anything like that, you're not going to be negatively impacted when it comes to all these changes to protect consumer privacy because you're not using any of their data right now. You're just using search queries to deliver these ads, right?
Yep, yep. So you'll find an image that you want. If you use it, you can go and use it, and then now that's no longer even an ad. Like you just put it in your content by choice.
Hmm.
I think that's the big difference. Like we're not paying you to go and take Square's image and put it in your blog post. So that just totally changes the whole equation, and it makes things way more trustworthy too. So at the end, when you're showing that to your audience, they're like, "Oh, you chose that that image."
Mhm. But I just even mean from like a search perspective, like when I'm searching on Google, it's because they're tracking all the places I've been on the internet. But when you guys are
Right.
delivering these ads, it's just based off the
Yeah.
search query, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a huge advantage for you guys when it comes to just kind of the advertising market. That's crazy. And then with the API on top of that, then is that like so it because you built Unsplash on your own API as well, right?
Yeah.
Does that mean so if someone, for example, using MailChimp again, if MailChimp is ranking high because they're they're promoting on the site. Does that mean when someone's using the API, it's going to be a similar result when someone searches up, they'll get the MailChimp ad early as well using the API?
Yeah, that's right.
That's crazy because that's that's awesome. That's that's just because that means then basically like on Medium and Google Slides, they're not only sponsoring and getting promoted posts on Unsplash, but they're also getting them around the internet with everyone using the API.
Right, right.
That is awesome. And so like I have a couple stats here today of just where like Unsplash today, I think 506 billion total views, 20 billion image views a month, 2.5 photos available, 2.8 billion downloads, 110 million downloads a month. How do you ensure the quality of the content with that like that such high volume? How do you ensure the content stays where it's at? Because obviously you can't manually filter through all the images like you used to when you're doing 10 every 10 days. So how do you ensure the quality is staying so high still?
We have a curation team, so still people, and
Wow.
members of the community as well. And we review all the images that come in. And if there's images that don't meet the community standards, we're giving feedback on those images so people know how to improve as well. But you can think of it like the App Store. So, when if you submit to Apple, they have a team that's reviewing and making sure that certain standards are met, so that when people see these images, that they're high quality. When they see the apps, they're high quality, and we do the same thing with images. And once you've had images accepted, we sort of take off some of the tape, and you're able to do more.
And so like what's the case for photographers like to submitting their photos? Like other than just being a part of the community, like how do you convince photographers to upload their work? Like what's the benefit they're getting on the back end of all of this?
There's usually multiple reasons why someone submits. I would say that if you looked at the pie, one of them is, hey, I got a lot of benefit from this site. I've been a creator and I'm making things. And I have some images that I could submit and help, create this great pool of images that we can all keep pulling from. And then what kicks in is they sort of see the impact. So they go away and they start getting emails with all the stats and the views and downloads that are happening. And they're like, hey, that's 1,000 times more than I'm getting on Instagram. And this is like no work for me. I don't have to keep posting. I don't have to do all this. I can just set it and forget it. So they'll come and submit more. And I think that's what starts to happen over time. Others want actually to be more in terms of like a professional photographer. And we've started to build things into the site that help make that happen. So one of the things we released recently is the ability to hire directly through Unsplash these photographers. So this is another full circle moment. Being able to hire creative talent. We built that now into Unsplash directly for the photographers who are submitting who want to go in that direction. But other people, this is more almost like a visual blog for them. These are images that I might having sitting in a folder somewhere. They're not doing anything, or they might be old on Instagram, or they might be my stuff that I want to submit here and I want people to see. It's my art, and I want to build, potentially some social capital around that, or have people be able to just see that and make something from it.
Mhm. Is there a concern that eventually the demand for photos will outpace kind of the photos available? Because you have 110 million downloads a month to the 2.5 million photos available. So every photo is getting downloaded multiple times. Like there's occasionally where like I'll see someone use a photo in their blog that I've used in mine and be like, oh, that's from Unsplash. Is there ever a concern that there's just so much demand that you almost don't have enough photos to kind of feed that demand?
We have way more supply than that is even like going up on the site right now. Like right now, we're being really like careful with getting the images up, and we're doing no work to bring in more images. Like that's all just word of mouth. So it just hasn't become a higher order problem enough where we feel that we need to do something there. And then when you look at what's happening externally, the cameras just keep getting better. All the tools around creating photography, it's enabling everybody. So that market is just getting massive. So we just don't feel that the wind is against our sails from an external factor, and internally, we don't see it as a higher order problem right now.
Speaking of photography equipment getting better, I'm pretty sure like iPhones now shoot more than 4 times better than your minimum like quality for photo
Yeah.
was when you first launched the site.
Yep.
What's your long-term vision for Unsplash?
So everybody who's coming to Unsplash is trying to make something happen, right? Whether you're submitting imagery or you're using the imagery, and you're going to go and create something with that. So for us, the visual is a fundamental like building block to creativity when you're going to go and make something, and we just want to make all great visuals accessible. So the more that we can get onto Unsplash, I think the more that people can make things happen. And that's ultimately what we're after. So any image that you find useful, our ideal world is that you can get that on Unsplash. And then Unsplash becomes this, visual infrastructure layer for the internet. You just see sort of visuals being spread everywhere and being used, and the source for that is going to be Unsplash, and that the benefits of that are going to be distributed through the people who are contributing on the site, the connections that happen between the people using them and the contributors. So I think it all just gets really powerful from that mission.
How important has it been to the direction and the way you're operating the company, operating on a long timeline versus a short timeline? I feel like entrepreneurs now, they just want to turn their company around, either exit super quickly or just 2, 3, 4 year timelines. But it sounds like you're operating on a pretty long timeline. How does that impact the way you run the business day to day?
Yeah, we've been building almost 10 years now already, and we always think, yeah, we think way longer term, and even when you look at our business model, there's a lot of people who are like, oh, you could create a SaaS model and build some creative tools, and or you could even charge for licensing for some of the images. Um, and we looked at some of those ideas, and we think there's potentially a time and place for some of these. But the reason we started with advertising was because we're thinking long, right? We said, let's put it here. It allows us to continue growing, not get in the way of any of that. We can build some of those other things later, but by thinking this long, it allows like a clarity of focus. And I think that's the difference, right? So when you're thinking this long, you can just be super focused. You don't have to um, make these concessions for short term, gains and different things that you're doing there. That's like why we don't write to every person who's a photographer and be like submit on Unsplash, because we're not thinking in that short term way. We're thinking about the longer term, and then building the system for that longer term.
Would Unsplash have worked had it been the main idea from the beginning?
I don't know. I think we were forcing things a bit too much in the beginning. I think one of the things that made Unsplash work is we didn't try to make it into a company. It was just this toy, this thing that we thought was useful, accidental company. So the 10 every 10 constraint, not having time, working on it, creating the aspirational reason why people want to come and submit to it. All of that was because we weren't like too much like raising the bar of it, and trying to make it this big thing at the beginning. So yeah, it's hard to say, but I think the initial thesis, if we would have built that, I think the initial thesis is correct either way. It's just the execution of it. I don't know how it would have turned out if we, really like tried to make it a company in a very short time frame at the beginning.
How has becoming a dad impacted you as an entrepreneur?
So she's 18 months now. Um, Harder than starting a company. I wish, because it's hard for people to start. I know it's hard for people to start companies usually after they have kids, right? There's like a bar and you're just like tired. I can see how that's really difficult. I wish somehow people could have like a snapshot of what it's like having a kid and the challenges of that, and then go back quick to a period where you didn't have the kids yet, because you could start a company and it'd be easier. Like I find the kid is challenging because he's just like you all have no control, right? It's like all control and power is gone from you. It's like torture with the sleep. Um, but then it's beautiful at the same time. So it changes perspective. A lot of people say this with kids. I think just watching, you just stare at them sometimes to watch like a human develop at the baseline level, with no filters, right? And I think that's one of the things. Even before she was born, I had a conversation with someone. They're like, "What's something you're looking forward to?" I'm looking forward to seeing someone who doesn't have any filters that were put on them from society. And I think that's a lot of what we all like from kids. We just see the unfiltered version of a human who's exploring and creative and clean slate. Um, and it's a beautiful thing. And I look at it as like my job to try to keep that intact as much as possible.
How often do you reflect on everything? This whole 10-year journey that you've been on so far, back in that noodle shop coming up with the original ideas for what Crew is going to become to launching Unsplash? Like, how often do you reflect on this entire journey?
A lot. I think weekly, if not daily, sometimes every other day. There's just moments. Um, you're walking your dog twice a day. You're just walking different places, and sometimes I'll try not to like listen to anything, and just be reflecting, but also being present at the same time. It's this weird balance. There's a lot of conversation about just trying to be present, right now, and how important that is. So I try to do that, but there's moments, where you're reflecting on, especially like milestone moments when those happen. When you've grown a lot and you write about it as a company, or you've launched something big, and after the launch, that's like a moment where you're, wow, this happened, and then went from that to this, and yeah, that's where it usually happens.
Are there any of those like specific moments that you think about often?
I think about the original part a lot. So sort of the first 6 months to a year, and I think it's because it's hard to believe that we came from that far and still the same company, and we've where we're at now mentally, how we think about things. Um, yeah, you don't see that very often, right? A lot of the stories that I hear, you almost just can't relate to them because startup founders went to Stanford. They went to business school. They had all this stuff, and we came from not knowing what a cap table was, what a term sheet was, what an accelerator was, and it's still like the same company today.
Talking about the relationship with the four co-founders, like how has that evolved over time?
Yes, so we're all still close. So Luke, me, and Steph, we're still in Unsplash. Angus, he was the other co-founder who went in the sale to Dribble. So he was leading Crew when we were doing the spin out, and we still have a good relationship with Angus as well.
That's awesome. Before I let you go here, I want to ask you the same standard set of questions I ask everybody at the end of every interview. I used to call them rapid fire, but people told me these aren't rapid fire questions. So I started calling it the Q&A, but then I realized this is a podcast. The whole thing's a Q&A, so that doesn't make sense. So I don't have a name for this section right now, but the first question is you're going to dinner. You can take three people, can be anybody dead or alive. Who do you take to dinner?
Three people that are alive. My wife is one. Uh, my daughter, 'cause she's a lot of fun. And then I'm trying to decide. You know, I'm trying to decide between like Buffett, Munger, just because they're super interesting. Someone who asks like good questions and is interesting. Toss up between one of those two.
What's some of the best advice you've ever gotten?
I think, yeah, the team you build is the company you build really hit with me, and it just is a focusing mechanism. So I love anything that makes something super clear for you, because when you're starting a company, you just have so many options, and nothing seems very clear. And that's a very big focusing statement, and it's true.
What is one thing about you people wouldn't expect?
I really like the cold.
Really?
I think that's a people probably wouldn't expect that.
Yeah, I don't think so. What is one thing that's so important everybody needs to know?
That you can start something, and that you probably should start something.
I like that. I like that a lot. For the last question, I like to flip the script a little bit. So instead of me asking the question, it's you asking the question, but it's not to me. So pretend you have a crystal ball. You can ask this crystal ball any question, you'll get the 100% honest answer. What is one question you'd want to know the answer to?
I already know this, but it's the it's the question that probably everybody wants to know. Um, is the goal well, if the goal of life is to be content and not necessarily, just seeking happiness all the time, would a content life actually then make you feel content, or would it just be boring?
Interesting.
So it's I have this mix of, if you follow Stoicism at all, it's the theory of nothing should be pulling you in a positive or negative direction. Like you shouldn't need this kind of food or need this affirmation from people. You should be able to be present, and negative things shouldn't affect you either because it's the same thing. It's a philosophy of being present. But I found if you operate in the present mind a lot, you you're just kind of like there, right? You're like this straight hum. So you're not necessarily happy, you're not sad, and you're here, and you're like, but is that it? It's really difficult thing, and then you sort of like part of stoicism is you can I, I I need to refine my reading on it more, but good things that happen, it's like you still like dumb them back into being stoic about them. So it's like it's this really weird way of being, and because it tracks back to what is the meaning of life, which was the original question that I was going to ask you, but the meaning is different for everybody. But when you factor down to like what are the feelings that you kind of operate with, and how do you um, run your life in a way that doesn't make you always seeking things. That's the goal that I thought was noble and that I'm after. But when you sit in that mind space, it's a really weird feeling.
Yeah, and I really like that question because it's something I think about too. And I think as humans we're supposed to be working towards something. And like I always tell people, like if you were like, okay, you're done for life, go sit on a beach, 3 weeks, you'd be bored out of your mind. So I think
Yeah.
it's like I think for me how I try to look at it is like I know I'm not supposed to answer this question, but it's just something I think about all the time. So I wanted to kind of throw my 2 cents in here is that like it's being present in that moment and still striving for something, but not necessarily letting the how it shakes out impact you. So if it
Right.
doesn't go exactly how you thought it would, to still be okay in that moment and to not like put your happiness in that outcome is kind of how I
Yeah.
try to live. So still strive for something, but I don't know, it's something I think about all the time too. So I really like that question. No one's ever asked it in that way before, and it really got me with that one. But I want to thank you so much for taking time to be on this podcast. I want to give you the floor. Where can the people find you? Plug anything and everything you got right now.
Twitter's good. At Mikael Cho, so my first name and last name. Spend mostly there.
Perfect. Awesome. I'll make sure everything's linked in the show notes down below so you can find it. I want to thank you once again for taking time to be on this podcast. I want to thank everybody for listening, whether you're listening the entire way through or you listen to bits and pieces. I really appreciate taking time to check this out. Everyone do me a big favor. Go and follow Mikael on Twitter. Go and check out Unsplash if you haven't already. I'll make sure everything's linked in the show notes down below. You can find me everywhere on social media at the Jacob Kelly. Feel free to come and say hello. My DMs are always open. As always, today's podcast is powered by TRUFAN. Thank you once again for listening, everybody. We'll talk soon.